Hello, guys. Welcome to the show again, where we are a unit talking a universe of memories concerning Doctor Who and many of the people who worked on it, in front of and behind the camera. And today, I'm really honoured to speak to a man that fought tooth and claw to get Doctor Who back on screens when it had finished in '89, and he went through an amazing 7 year period of trying to get the rights to it and produce the Doctor Who film, which we eventually got in 1996, starring Paul McGann as a Doctor. I'd like to welcome him now to you. It's none other than Philip Segal. How are you, Phil?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Phil, you were born in England. In fact, you were born in Southend-on-Sea in Essex, weren't you?
Yes, I
Yeah.
was. Yeah, Rochford Hospital.
Yeah. Um, what is your memories of Southend-on-Sea as a child? Because it was sort of seaside town, isn't it?
Well, it was, but it was a dying seaside. It was a Victorian dead seaside town, in the late 60s, 70s. I had fun memories, but it was very isolated. Nobody came out to the coast.
Yeah.
Now of course it's hilarious. My father was born. He was a Cockney, and he was born in Bermondsey.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, you go down to St. Catherine Dock today, you can't find a flat for £7 million. When he was a little boy, you wouldn't go down there. I mean, it was bombed and it was so. But anyway, cut to, I think the early 2000s, and it became too expensive for young folk to buy in London. So, they moved out to the coast. They found Southend, they found Chalkwell, Westcliff, all of those small Lee, and, they started buying up property. It was on the beach, it was cheap. Now all of a sudden it's regentrified. But when I was a kid, the we still had the Kurzel, and we still had the penny arcades, and we had the longest pier in the world. But as a kid, it's your stomping ground, right? I mean, it's where you hang out, and it's all you know. But having gone back in recent years and sharing it with friends, and or just to see what life is like, it's like time travel. It's a very different place.
It has changed a lot. Yeah, I've only been there, I think, on one occasion, and but that was in what about 10 years ago, I think, or something. And uh, it was awful quiet.
Oh,
It really was. You could
yeah.
hear like you almost see tumbleweeds going down the street. It was
Oh,
really, yeah,
yeah.
you know. So yeah, it was an experience, I suppose. I was only there briefly for one night, but yeah. So I didn't get to see too much of it, but yeah. Um, so 1962, you were born a year before, or roughly a year before, Doctor Who aired on for the first time on BBC television.
That's right.
When did it first capture your imagination, Phil? What was your first memory of Doctor Who?
Well, it was my grandfather. I was on his knee. We watched An Unearthly Child together. I mean, I was, scared out of my mind, and he loved, my grandfather he was an incredible man. He was a jeweler, a watchmaker. He was a warden during the war. He was a violinist. He was an artist. He was an awesome human being, and he
Yeah,
loved fantasy and science fiction. And so, his black and white TV was a window into an incredible world. And I started to sort of see the show, and of course Patrick Troughton came along, and that enthralled. And then because it was also the television was my babysitter, both parents worked, so they were happy to stick me in front of a TV whenever they had the
yeah,
chance. And of course, John Pertwee came along, and then the great Tom Baker, and on and on and on. Um, so it was one of those things where the character, it became indelible in my mind, and I think that's how it really sort of attracts everybody who falls in love with the world. This is a very unique character, even though obviously its folklore has been bolted on over the years by various different writers. The essence of what it became, I think, is so incredibly unique and special that, if you love the world of fantasy and science fiction, I do think you can't help but being drawn to the essence of who he is.
Were you always interested in science fiction? I mean, from that point
Well,
onwards, I mean,
well,
different
my
genres of it.
Well, I would actually categorize it. I was more of a fantasy guy than a sci-fi guy. I mean,
Yeah,
my mother, was a voracious reader. She turned me on to Jules Verne. So I fell in love with Jules Verne. I could not get through Asimov. So so at the time, I would probably arguably say I was more fantasy than science fiction. But science fiction as a sort of universal kind of umbrella, absolutely. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of it. Couldn't get enough of it. Whenever I saw it, it enthralled me.
yeah, that's fantastic. So, what precipitated your move to America? Because you went there, what, about 15 or 16 you were, I think, at the time?
No, I was actually earlier than
I was
that.
earlier.
We originally came. I mean, God bless Wikipedia and everything else.
Yeah.
And but I got to the States originally in 72. But my father was the youngest of six kids. There were 22 years between him and his oldest sister.
Wow.
And so a lot of his family left the UK during the war. One of my aunts lost her husband tragically, and so she had five kids and came to the States with them,
Yeah.
Uh, they got on a boat and they went looking for a better place, a better time, a better world. And my father was always a gypsy, he was never happy in one place at one time, and he had decided that he wanted to be with his family, and most of his family at the time were in the US, although we still had family in the UK, we still do, but a lot of them were in the US, in California, and in of all places, Las Vegas. And so, he convinced my mother to pack us up and ship us off. And so it wasn't a decision that was made by a family. It was something that I was thrown into. And I have to say, at first, it was very scary
Yeah.
uh, because I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to friends. I was pulled out of my environment, which, as a young boy, that's a really difficult thing to do. But bless my father's, heart, he only thought about one thing, himself. And so it was all about, what his whims and what he wanted to do, and that's what he wanted to do. So that's what we did.
Yeah. Yeah. So there you were in America. Um, so you had to make new friends. Were you at that age where you still have to go to school
Oh
then?
yeah, no,
Right. Yeah.
absolutely. And the thing about that is, there were no transcripts from England, so they really didn't know what grade to put me in, and
Ah,
interestingly enough, when they tested me, I tested, which doesn't say a lot, by the way, for the US educational system even back then, but I tested much higher than anyone in the class that I should have been in for my age. So they didn't know what to do with me because,
yeah.
they didn't want to put me too far ahead for fear that it would be difficult for me to adjust. On the other hand, if they left me where I was, they didn't think I was going to learn anything. So
Yeah.
that was sort of wacky. But yeah, no, I went straight into school, and I lived in San Diego in La Jolla. I went to La Jolla High School and then to San Diego State University, and came to LA in '84 after I graduated from college.
And that point, you you were moving into the TV industry at that point when you were sort of mid
Well, I
80s.
wanted to I
Yeah.
wanted to be yeah, I wanted to be in the business.
Yeah.
I always knew from a young age that I wanted to tell stories. I just didn't really know how or what it meant.
Yeah.
So, and there was no one, I didn't have anyone to help me. So, I've told this story before, but of course you couldn't do it today, you'd be arrested. But I climbed over the fence at 20th Century Fox, and I found myself standing in the parking lot, and here comes this red Porsche. And this guy rolls down the window and he says, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for a job." And he said, "Well, first of all, you're in my parking space. You're standing in my parking space. And second of all, I don't know if anyone around here has a job." He said, "We do use interns occasionally. Go inside and talk to my assistant and see if she's interested in you being an intern."
Yeah,
I didn't know that guy was Mike Fenton. And Mike Fenton and Jane Feinberg were, award-winning casting directors. And of course, it was Mike that did all of Spielberg's movies. So he had done, and he had even cast The Godfather. And so, E.T., he had cast all these films. So I didn't know that at the time. I went in, talked to his assistant. She put me to work, for free as an intern. Of course, I had nowhere to live, so I slept in my car in the park across the street until 4 o'clock in the morning when the ranger would move me on.
yeah.
But there I was until his assistant, she was pregnant and she left, and he offered me a job as his assistant, and that's how I broke into the business.
Well, extraordinary. Just your sheer grit and determination. And
Well,
or cheek even, as we say over here in some ways,
yeah,
to
no,
get in
absolutely.
there.
Well, desperate people. I was very determined. I got that from my father at least. He wouldn't take no for an answer. If he wanted something, he always figured out how to get it. And
Yeah,
I didn't know, I didn't know what I was doing was appropriate or inappropriate. I just knew that I wanted something and I was going to try to figure it out with no help from anyone. So I was fortunate. I maybe it's kismet. I was in the right place at the right time, and it broke me into the business. I was able to build relationships and my career got off to a good start.
yeah. I was amazed by or rather very intrigued by something. We're skipping a little bit ahead here, but when you worked your way through different departments and so on, you went from casting assistant to literary agent, I believe. Um,
Well, I was a trainee, yeah, at
yeah,
ITM.
and then you got onto working for Columbia
Yes,
Pictures. That's right,
yes, yes.
and then on to ABC. Now, the reason I was interested in asking you this was because I am to this day a huge fan of Twin Peaks. And I saw your name attached to this, and I've been dying to ask you, what was your involvement with the show?
Well, I was the network executive.
Right.
So, the show, well, it was originally just it was supposed to be a 2 hour movie for the summer, and then it became a 6 episode commitment, and then it took off. But I thought I was going to get fired for that one, because it was a very difficult production, with David and Mark Frost, who really weren't interested in making a television series. It was just fun for them. They didn't care who killed Laura Palmer. They never did. And they had no interest in really trying to figure out who killed Laura Palmer. But my boss was Bob Iger, who's now the chairman of Disney. He was my boss, and I found myself in his office quite a bit. And I'll never forget those meetings where he'd go, "Phil, what are we doing here?" And I said, "Bob, I'm trying to get my head around this project, because they buried it. They didn't want it on the air at first. They just thought it was never going to go on the air. It went on the air, and of course it did a 31 share, which was in those days huge, huge, huge. So it was like hurry up and make more kind of thing, with no thought given to the fact that the production team that we were dealing with were put together with, chewing gum and a lot of hope. But at the end of it, David Lynch, you know, he's a character in and of himself. I mean, he's a lot mellower today than I think he was back then. And even back then, He was incredibly eccentric and very difficult to deal with.
That's interesting. I mean, I wasn't really aware of David Lynch until probably Twin Peaks. I didn't know about his other body of work prior to that. So I caught up with that after the fact, if you know what I mean, and became a real genuine fan of his films and so on, as
Yeah.
well, his movies. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. I've always wanted to ask you about your connection with Twin Peaks because, as I say, they were doing rather. They stopped for a while because Columbia took, sorry, not Columbia, Showtime took over, and
Well, they brought it back. I
they
mean,
brought it back. That's right.
which
But
was
but,
a
but then at that
disaster.
time, what was happening was there was events being run, like big fan events,
Mm.
celebrating the series. Um, but then that kind of sort of ground to a halt, and they weren't allowed to do them anymore. And so someone at the top or wherever it was shutting these things down, and for whatever reason, I don't know. So that was a shame
Well,
because
it
they
was
were great
cost.
communities.
Yeah, it's cost. It's always about money.
Yeah,
When Showtime, I mean, and I know David Nevins, who was running the network at the time. I knew him very well because he bought him and Kevin Riley were the NBC executives when I sold them Sequest. So I had known David for a long, long time, and I had run into him. Actually, I was at the network working on something else, I think, at the time. But I'd ran into him, and I did say to him, because he said, we're bringing back Twin Peaks. I said, yeah. I said, be very, very careful. Be very careful. Put that man on a short leash, and they didn't. And of course, uh, a commitment of what for $20 million turned into 30 or 40, and the next thing you don't have anything. I think that it's very, very tricky because it's one thing to have a great idea. It's one thing to have a franchise or a brand that the fandom loves, but it's another thing to reboot it or to execute a project of that nature without having the kind of people at the helm that can steer the ship and make sure that it's an evolution of something. And even that is tricky because most fans, they want to hang with characters that they love and they want familiar stories and scenes, and that's not what creators want to do. They don't want to just cookie cut something and give you more of the same. They want to try something else. They want to stretch their wings. And oftentimes, the two clash. I mean, and we've seen that in so many different franchises. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast.
yeah, and that's exactly what David did. He everything that the fans were kind of like expecting, he did the complete opposite of.
Right. Well, that was
um,
David.
in
I mean,
particular, the season three, the one that came back after 25 years, that was so different to what we originally saw. And fans were kind of like either left cold by it or um, it, found something good to enjoy in the different approach he had with it. I think the thing with his work is that what often happens is you have to take a few years to sit back and then review it, watch it again, and then things start to make more sense. I think with the passing of time, that often happens with people of his kind of like his generation of filmmakers, I suppose.
I think what you
Surrealist,
have to do, yeah, I mean, when you watch it, I think what you have to do, if you can, is you have to strip away the idea that you're going to get a story with a beginning and a middle and end. You have to throw that out. That you're not coming to this experience for that. What you're coming to the experience for is a character study. That's what David Lynch will give you in spades, is a character study. And so what you have to do is try to focus on just the sheer kind of genius and insanity of what's going on subtextually in that moment, for that character, whether it's, psychological, emotional, spiritual. It's all of those essences that you are kind of watching. Don't watch for story. You have to watch for character involvement. It's almost as if you're a fly on the wall and you're watching a day in the life of. And if you can do that, you can definitely get a different and a fresh experience. But if you're coming for a story, you've come to the wrong place.
That's very true, Phil. Yeah, very true indeed. Yeah. Um, but getting on to we'll get off that now. I don't want to overdose it with Twin Peaks, even though I'm a huge fan of it. But uh, you did work with Steven Spielberg's company, Amblin Television, didn't you?
I did. I ran his television company for almost
Yeah,
6 years.
yeah. And how did that? How did you sort of fall into that position, or how did that kind of occur?
Well, I had met Stephen earlier because when I worked for Mike Fenton as a casting assistant, we had done Amazing Stories for NBC. So I knew Stephen, but what happened was when I was at Columbia, um, I had obviously started to build a relationship with friends that I was growing up with in the business. And a friend of mine at William Morris, and I were actually, we were, this sounds so Hollywood, but we were on a golf course. And he said to me, he said, "Hey," he said, I heard that Spielberg is wants to launch his television company." He said, "You worked for him, didn't you?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I did." He said, "Well," he said, "Do you want to go up for it?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" Thinking, I don't know. Who knows? Well, I was in my office at Columbia one day, got a phone call saying, "Hey, your name was brought up to Kathy Kennedy, and she wants to meet you." So I said, "Okay." So I jumped in my car and I drove down to Sony, the old MGM studios, because that's where they were filming Hook. And I met with Kathy, and we had a wonderful conversation. And the bond came because she and I were alma mater of the same school. We both went to San Diego State. And so there was this kind of little connection there. And of course, she knew that I knew Mike Fenton, and that I'd worked on Amazing Stories, and that I, had been at an agency. And so it was all, it was all sort of interesting. Um, and then so what happened next was I got a call to say, "Hey, Stephen would like to meet you." So I was asked to come back. So I came back and I was sitting in the foyer of Kathy's office. I was supposed to be there at 10. Well, 12:30 came around and I was still sitting there. And then finally, a PA came in and said, "I'm ready to take you to the set." And I said, "Okay." So we jumped in a golf cart and drove down to this incredible stage, and walk onto the stage. And the first thing that hits you is that smell of smoke, the bug juice that was used to smoke stages. And you go through this kind of bridge, and you climb up these various platforms, and the next thing you know, you're in this incredible lagoon with this massive galleon and all of the trimmings of that incredible set. And it was just breathtaking. And so I stood there for a minute or two, and then I was brought down to camera, and there was Stephen, and he was standing there having a conversation with Bob Hoskins and Dustin Hoffman, both in uniform. So my interview and conversation with Stephen was absolutely influenced by Bob Hoskins and Dustin Hoffman. No question. It was surreal. It was absolutely surreal. But anyway, it was a wonderful conversation. It lasted about 25 minutes until he had to go back to camera, and that was it. And I was taken, back on the golf cart back to Kathy's office. And I guess between then and then, he must have radioed her or called her or whatever. But I got back to her office and I was offered the job.
So would you have been there when they did that series called Amazing Stories?
So Amazing Stories was in 1984.
Ah,
So now he brought it back. It was brought back much, much, much later, but the original two seasons on NBC happened in 84. So I worked on season one, first as a casting assistant, and then I moved over to post-production. So it was from there that I got into the agent training program at ICM because I started to think about how I was going to do what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to be a producer.
yeah,
And I didn't really understand how to do that, but I had met enough people and had gotten some good advice to people that said, good producers that had basically said a good producer knows everyone else's job. So in order to learn everybody else's job, you got to go do everybody else's job, if you want to be taken seriously.
yeah, yeah.
And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? I mean, there's, how many jobs are there? So I tried I tried to keep that in my sights, while I was figuring things out. But yeah, the first season of the original series I worked on.
So um, you, I believe, which when you were having meetings and so on, I think you were talking with the BBC at one point, weren't you? About potential
Well,
things,
well,
projects or something.
well, I had started sniffing around Doctor Who when I was at Columbia. In those days we didn't have email,
Yeah,
and the only way you could communicate was by phone or by letter.
yeah,
So I wrote a letter. I would start writing letters to the BBC, and it's the most wonderful experience. It's deliciously bureaucratic. And in those days, it was really bureaucratic. It was wonderful. So, one or two of the letters, one letter might come back, oh, thank you for your inquiries, but there is no one to talk to here. Good luck. Or thank you for your inquiry. The person you need to speak to is on vacation. Or thank you for your inquiry. The person you need to speak to is no longer with us. And whatever it was. And so, but I kept writing and I ignored all of it. I just kept writing and outlining who I was and what I was thinking and why I thought it was worth, letting a US studio, run with it. And I had, obviously Columbia Pictures at the time. It was a great pedigree.
yeah.
The letterhead was legitimate. It looked good. So I took advantage of all of that. But it wasn't until I managed to break through on a couple of levels, and I got through to a guy by the name of Tony Greenwood, and he was running at the time. It was called BBC Enterprises,
That's right.
which
Yeah,
was the arm of the BBC that was allowed to exploit content. The BBC itself wasn't a profit center; it wasn't allowed to be, but through a loophole in their charter, they were able to own companies that could actually make money. And that's what Enterprises was. It was supposed to be. But Tony was in the merchandising department. He was in the toy department. And Tony, bless his heart at the time, goes, well, wait a minute. This might be an opportunity to take advantage of, maybe we could sell some toys. So he became a friend and he would write to me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I have a human being, a warm-blooded human being who's actually willing to talk to me. And so we jumped on the phone a bunch of times. We talked, and it was that sort of a thing. But it wasn't until I got to Amblin that my opportunity really uh, launched, because I was in my office at Amblin and I got a call from the studio from Universal, who was our partners, and they said, "Hey, Alan Yentob is here. from the BBC. He was the director of the BBC. He's here, and he would like to meet with Stephen, and he would like to be given a tour of the Sequest sets.
Right.
And I said, well, I don't know if I can handle the first part of that, but I can certainly handle the second part because Stephen's schedule was, and Stephen's very mercurial. So the idea of saying, hey, come and shake someone's hands in those days was not exactly, his idea of a good time. So you had to figure out clever ways to corral Stephen in those times. But I said, but I'm happy to meet him. And he said, well, that would be fine. And if he could meet Stephen, that would be wonderful. So I met him. Off he went to the first stage, stage 28, which was our main stage where I met him, and I
Yeah.
I gave him my speech about Sequest, the show that I had created, and talked to him about why we're doing it, and in my passion for Irwin Allen, and why I couldn't get the rights to Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea because they'd already been gobbled up, blah 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 blah. Anyway, but this poor man, what he didn't realize was that for the next 45 minutes, as I'm walking him around, and we were on 9 sound stages, as I'm walking him around, literally all it was, and over here is where the airlock is for, I love Doctor Who. And he's starting to look at me like who is this madman? And I was terrible because in those days my arrogance level was through the roof, right? So I didn't have the filter of when is enough on the hard sell, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, we get to the end of the 45 minutes. Fortunately, I got him to meet Stephen very briefly. And so I had a very nice wrap up to the meeting, and we ended the conversation with, he said, well, if the next time you are in London, he said to me, stop by and we'll have lunch. So I shook his hand and off he went.
Yeah.
Well, the next time I was in London, I mean, it's like I go back to my office and I say to my assistant, you know, get my schedule for the next 3 weeks, and get me on a plane to London.
Yeah. Yeah.
So literally, I mean, it was embarrassing how quickly I moved. I mean, I wasn't, even though it was in pre-production on
Yeah.
Sequest. We hadn't gone to air yet, but and I called his office. I had my assistant call his assistant to say, hey, Phil's going to be in London in 3 weeks on this day. Can we set lunch with Alan? And sure enough, we got a lunch appointment.
Brilliant.
So I jumped on that plane and off I went to London. And it turned out that the car that picked me up took me to his home. And so he had a lunch catered for us at his house. And it was incredible. He was incredible. And it turned out that he was a huge Doctor Who fan. Huge
Ah,
Doctor Who
yeah.
fan.
Yeah.
But he was very careful about who he mentioned that to, because all the cronies around him wanted to move on. They were done. They didn't want to spend another dime on Doctor Who. They were over it. 700 episodes. Let's move on. Enough of Doctor Who. They didn't want anything to do with it,
Yeah.
and they went out of their way to make sure that nothing happened. But fortunately, because I kept pushing with Alan, he crafted the whole sort of mechanics of how he was going to slip me in and get this deal done. And he was incredible. He was absolutely incredible. And without Alan Yentob, it wouldn't have come back.
Staggering. Um, so the 7 years it took you, I mean, you must have had an awful lot of determination. Were there moments where you thought, "Oh, I can't do this anymore"? Did it become too much?
Um, well, it's a very interesting question, actually, because you know, in those days, I was just driven and passionate. So the idea that you learned, and you learn as a producer, very early on that no means yes. That's what you learn. And the reason why, it doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense, but it makes all the sense in the world is because everything has a time and everything has a place. And so you don't know, in that moment of time, no. But that moment in time will be gone. And you can't go backwards, you can only go forwards. And we don't know what tomorrow brings. And so I was always, I was very sort of focused on the idea that it was never no forever. It was no for today. What's going to happen tomorrow? And so yeah, there were moments where I stopped the phone calls and the letters um, over weeks or months, and then something would happen. It was really weird. It was like I'd get a letter from the BBC, so a weird letter going, do you have a proposal, or is there a budget we can look at, or do you have a script, or have you thought about a script? Weird letters. And I go, well, what's driving this? And so in my conversations with Tony Greenwood, who was my sort of super secret sleuth, giving me very inside baseball information, I started to learn about what was going on. There were, in those days, the BBC had all kinds of producers with offices there, and who knows if they were on the payroll. I don't know, but there were people there who had managed to somehow give the rights to a movie company, to a small independent movie company that thought that they had the rights to it. But the deal was so complicated and it was done in such a way that the BBC made sure that they were on a very short leash. So if they didn't start production in a certain time and on a certain day, they would lose those rights. And they had this very ambitious 35-40 million-dollar movie they wanted to make with a script that was floating around. I don't recall whether I saw it or not. I don't recall. But they couldn't raise the money. And it was patently obvious why. It was like, well, they weren't, I mean, in my estimation, they hadn't thought this through. Here you have a franchise that had been off the air since 89, I guess, 87, 88. It started to fade in 89. It was officially done with. And, poor Sylvester McCoy, who is, in my opinion, totally underrated as an actor and as a human being. He's just an awesome person, and he's so intelligent. And he's such a lovely man. And they just destroyed the show. They wrote it into the ground. It broke my heart. But that is literally the calling card you're going to share with financiers to make a $40 million movie with. So this is the only way I knew that you could relaunch this is on television, and you had to relaunch it with people who cared, because if they didn't care, you're going to get more of the same. And a lot of the people that worked on BBC on Doctor Who were good, talented people. This is not in any way me trying to be disrespectful, but at the end of the day, if you don't have it in your heart to really try to reinvent this and grow it and push the envelope, you were going to give them more of the same. And I worried that the institutional nature of the BBC at the time was just give them more of the same. I don't want to work on this project. I don't want to work on this show. I've been assigned to this or whatever. So that was my kind of my launch pad, because I had heard that in a week or two the rights were going to end, and this movie would be no longer. And so I had called Tony Greenwood, had a conversation with him. He knew, and he said, I think this is your moment. And I said, okay, well, what do I do? He said, I think you've got to call Alan Yentob and you've got to give him a passionate, you know, kind of plea. And I did. And that was it. He said, Phil, if you want the rights, they're yours. Have your lawyers call us with a proposal. Let's try to make something work. And I literally, I got a deal turned around in 2 weeks, and it was a starting point, obviously. But the point is we made the open, and Alan was kind enough to say, "Okay, we're taking this very seriously. Please engage Phil with a conversation." And that was the linchpin.
So that must have been, I imagine, for you, Phil, a huge weight had lifted in a sense. You've got somewhere after all this fighting to get to where you needed to get to. You're
Oh, I
now
was
being
over.
listening to. It's now positive. You're there. You're going in the proper direction now.
Yeah,
Uh, it must have been an amazing feeling for you. Yeah,
it was.
yeah,
It was. It was a real triumph. It was a real testament to being passionate and being dedicated. I mean, you that's what you do. So I felt vindicated in some ways, and but I think that the exuberance lasted about 30 seconds, because
okay.
once I had sort of come down off of the triumph of being able to get something negotiated. um, then I stopped and thought to myself, okay, well, now I've got to make it.
Yeah,
What do I do? So,
yeah,
it is that heady moment that comes and goes, and then you've got to go, okay, well, how do we get this to the finish line?
yeah, yeah. So, how long was it? I mean, how long was the sort of period before you kind of went seriously into post production of it? Uh, uh, you know, from the moment that you
Well,
got the kind of green light to really seriously, making calls, getting people involved in working on it, and so on.
Well, it was complicated because we went through many, many scripts at Amblin, and it just it was one of those things where my timing wasn't great with Stephen, and he was also thinking about his legacy, and then Katzenberg came along and tried to convince him that he should, just like Louis B. Mayer, have his own studio, and so it was at a certain point where Stephen said, I just don't want to do this. I don't want to do it. It's feeling too much like Indiana Jones to me. I don't know. I'm not sure I want to do this. And I said, okay, well, I understand, let me see if that makes a difference to Alan Yentob. And it did for 5 minutes. And I thought, this is not going to happen. But literally on the same day that I had to tell Alan that Stephen wasn't interested, I got a call from Fox, saying, because I had talked about it to all the networks and I got close, but it was Fox. It was my friend Bob Greenblatt, who was running it at the time, called me and said, Phil, he said, I think we want to try this, but we need to structure this in such a way that, if the pilot does well, then we'll give you 6 additional episodes. But we need to structure it that way because I've got a slot for it in my movie of the week space, but we'll structure the deal as a pilot.
Yeah,
And I said, so I was able to call Yentob and say, I've got bad news and I've got great news. And so it was because I had a home for it and I was ready to keep going, that he was fine. And we were able to get going. And so that was in 95. And then in 96, obviously, we were off to the races.
was it always was so in terms of the casting? First of all, I imagine you had to the first person you had to secure will have been the actor that's going to be playing the main the doctor. Is that right? That's how it would
Yes.
work. Yeah. So I think I remember hearing that you always your first choice was always Paul McGann.
Yeah,
Did you
I
have
there was
anyone else had that not happened? I mean, because
no,
he
I
took some
didn't.
persuasion, I believe, at the beginning, didn't he, to
Yeah, it
do
did.
it?
And he did. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
well, I had seen, I was looking at a lot of English actors in films. And I knew that this had to be somebody that we could grow with. If it was a star, and of course, because, Fox wanted they wanted a celebrity, they wanted a name, and the studio, Universal wanted a name, BBC wanted a name. If you're, I had four masters at the time.
right.
And so it was really difficult for me, but I had seen with Nail and and
Yeah,
I
brilliant
just,
film.
yeah,
Love
yeah.
that
And
film.
I thought, you know what? He has got there was a certain intensity about him, but there was also a sort of charm about him and an innocence about him and and an incredible connection, very soulful. His eyes,
Yeah,
just manner, he was very down to earth, and I thought this feels like somebody who could portray all the various different levels that I wanted in this, but and I had arranged to meet him in London, and we had a lovely conversation, but at that original meeting, he wasn't going to do it.
yeah,
He wasn't interested. But also at the same time, I was meeting with Michael Crawford. I mean, the list went on and on. The list is out there, and it's been out there for a long time.
yeah,
Most of the names on the list are true. I met with, Alan Rickman. I met with. I mean, there was you know, there was a lot of them, but at the end of the day, uh, it was really going to boil down to who would be willing to sign a deal saying that they would commit to a series.
yeah,
And none of those names would. They just wouldn't. And so I was in a very difficult position because it was an exhaustive process. But I managed to wear them down only because we had an air date. So they had committed to making this. We had a deal, and they had an air date. And so in those days, when you had a deal and you had an air date, it would have taken an act of Congress to pull them to shut it down.
yeah,
It's just a different world than it is today.
yeah. Extraordinary. So you've got Paul in place eventually. Um, was it always your idea to have Sylvester um, come back for those 15, 20 minutes at the beginning to have that changeover, the regeneration? Because I know in people that were thinking later on that maybe it may have worked better had that been a flashback sequence, perhaps later when the doctor might have been talking to Grace and explaining his, who he is and so on. Do you feel that do you still stand by the fact that it works better at the beginning rather than a later option to explain?
Well,
Yeah,
no, another excellent question. There were two things. There was my first my first issue was that I wanted to make darn sure that I got this project into the mythology. I wanted to make sure that that the regeneration happened for a couple of reasons. One, because I wanted to make sure that we made our mark, that that Sylvester's doctor regenerated into the next doctor because he was the next doctor. And I wanted to keep the mythology because I thought that that was the right thing to do. At the time, the BBC said absolutely not. You're not going to do it. Nobody wanted him, they didn't want him to do it. They said, no, we're not doing that. And you have to come up with another story. And I managed to convince them and explain to them. I mean, because at the time I was really, really passionate about the mythology and I was very well versed in it. And at the time, there were very few people who had as much information and knowledge and passion about the show and the characters as I did. And so I considered myself an aficionado, and they did too, because when I would sit in a room and talk to you about you know, the in the weeds sort of Doctor Whovian world, they just thought I was nuts. So and there was no one who could argue with me because there was no one who knew it better than I did at the time. And so I explained to them why the reason why we needed to do this was not just to satisfy the audience who will want to know what happened to Sylvester McCoy and why we can't start again because that would have been confusing and I think unsatisfying to the fans of the show. But also at the time, we were still in a very kind of arcane narrative process. So, you had to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And getting to introduce America to, I had to assume that nobody knew who he was. So I needed to explain, a lot of things. Unfortunately, in the writing of it, a lot of it got missed because the writing was not as strong as it could have been and should have been and I just ran out of time. In terms of your question about should it have been a flashback, it's a very interesting point because it would have been another way to approach how we arrived. You could have just had the TARDIS arrive in San Francisco and out comes, Paul and off we go. And we would have been, in some ways, we probably would have been better off, not only in terms of time, but in terms of cost, but it would have been something that would have ended up on the cutting room floor because the network wouldn't have they would have said, well, you're just wasting time. You need to advance the ball and have an adventure. Don't worry about that. You can do that in the next episode or how we got here later. And that's what they would do to you. And they had final cut. I didn't. So I didn't know what would happen. So I knew that I had to film this in such a way that you were stuck with it.
I suppose because at that point, of course, you had to do a lot of exposition because, you know, the way television is, you didn't know whether you were going to get a series off the back of it, where you could have time to breathe and expand on things more had it gone
Right.
on for a season or two. And then you would have been able to go back to the history more and, and so on and so on and unravel it.
Right.
But I suppose because you've only got a 90-minute movie, I can see where you're coming from, Phil. That you had to explain an awful lot of the history because you had such little time in which to do it.
Yeah.
Really,
No, it was a challenge. I mean,
yeah.
there were so many issues, Frank, that I was dealing with. It was not just about Sylvester McCoy and whether or not he would come back. It was literally like, I was literally dealing with, well, this police box, we don't want that. You come up with a new time machine because that's old.
Oh no, no, you can't get rid of the police box. I'm sorry.
So,
That would be a crime against
you should have been in those.
everything.
You,
Mm,
you should have been in those meetings.
mm.
And so what happened was one of the network executives turned around and said to me, "Well, that's just too British. Nobody knows what a police box is. It's too British." So I had done my homework and I said, "Well, excuse me, it's not British. It's an American invention. It was actually American. It was invented in New York City.
Yeah.
Uh, the police box. Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
it was a
Not
an
many people
American.
realize that. Yeah, I didn't. I
No,
didn't know that really
it was
either.
an no, it
Yeah.
was an American policing invention that
Yeah.
ultimately got expanded.
Yeah.
to where it was a mobile communications office for policemen. And once I had said that to them, they couldn't argue that it was British anymore, and it was like, and I wouldn't let it go. I said, you got to get out of the weeds on all this stuff. Let's talk, let's think about big picture. How do we get this to series? Let's think about, the scope of the film.
Yeah.
You know, let's get that locked down. Don't worry about, because they would love to do it. The bean counters and suits, they didn't have answers to any of the big, really good creative questions they should have, rolled up their sleeves and helped me with. So the best thing to do is just chew around the perimeter. Let's just go for low hanging fruit. Does it have to be a police box?
Yeah.
I mean, silly stuff, but it's serious stuff because
Oh
you got
yeah.
to
Yeah.
stop and you got to literally spend God knows how many weeks just going around in circles with some stupid thing before they would let go of it and allow you to move on.
Yeah. I have to I just want to go back just slightly to what we were talking about Sylvester, and just want to say, um, uh, I felt that wherever you stand with the positioning of whether it was right or wrong to have him at the beginning or whether he came into it later, that's not that's by the by. But his performance in it, I thought was fantastic. For those 15 minutes he was on screen, he owned that screen.
Yeah.
And I also found that him being a bit older, um, he seemed to have aged into it more, matured into the Doctor more, if you see what I mean. And he played an older Doctor. I think he had a lot more gravitas, I thought, you know?
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
and this is a fact about most, if not all, British actors who are professionals. They didn't care whether, a British actor doesn't care whether it's film, television, or theater. They look for the quality of the project and they gravitate to things that are fun, challenging, and pay well. Um, they're working actors. And so, you didn't have the issues you had here in the States with, well, you're going to do a television show at the time. You can't be you can't be a film star. You're going to kill your career. It was ludicrous, and it was all about money and greed. It was like they couldn't make as much putting a piece of talent on a television show as they could putting them in a movie, and it was their careers. It was all greed and superficial crap. But Sylvester was never given, in my opinion, his due. And the writing and the stupidity of that show, I mean, with all due respect, that last season it was an embarrassment to the franchise, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of people out there, who at the time, loved it, and I don't mean to denigrate them. It's my opinion, but I felt that it was just a load of BS. And it was tragic because he is so talented. And you know what? You give him good material and you put him in a great environment, and he would have risen to the occasion. And the reason why that performance is as good as it is because he was treated with respect. He walked on that set and he owned that TARDIS. He was absolutely he was in love with it, and he played with it, and he understood what we were trying to do, and he gave it all. He gave it his all. And it was because it was treated with the gravitas that it was treated that he rose to the occasion because he had the ability. He had those qualities. He just was never given a chance. So I am thrilled that that is on film.
Yeah, I me too. That he was really stunning in that, I thought. He really was. As was, of course, our leading man, Paul McGann, who's a very fine actor. And he again has great screen presence, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He's got those piercing eyes and he's got that voice that people love. He's got a great sort of presence to him.
Yeah.
Um, so, Phil, overall, did he rise to the challenge for you? Did he exceed what you expected of a doctor that you were that you
Oh,
wanted on it?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I
yeah,
mean, yeah. I mean, he was there from minute one. He loved to contribute as as every day he just got more and more confident with what he was doing. He owned it by the time the show, we'd finished filming, he owned it. And he just, he was such a delight to work with. He cared about every moment. He cared about every scene, and he tried to contribute wherever he could. But he always came to set, ready to work. Always had his lines down, and was able to just then throw them away so that he could just get lost in the moment. And he never ever complained or thought that anything was beneath him, or unlike Eric Roberts. But
I was going to
but
ask you about him in a minute. Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
we don't have enough time. But yeah, I just couldn't be happier for him.
yeah. And how about the co-stars, Daphne Ashbrook and E.G. So?
Well,
How do you find those actors to work with?
well, delight. I mean, Daphne was, ridiculously amazing. I mean,
Yeah,
for her audition got her the role. She walked into that room and she was a delight from just walking in the room. She was a little ditzy, and she
yeah,
was
yeah,
laughing, and she wasn't, she was confident, but she just clearly wasn't she really wasn't aware of the gravity of what she was getting into and what Doctor Who was. She didn't understand.
no,
And
no,
she brought that naivete, and that was beautiful because the first time she meets the doctor, and we find out that she's starting to realize that this is not a human being. This is either a whack job or something else. It was bringing all of that. Okay, this is too much for me to the screen.
yeah,
She brought it to the audition, and she was a delight and remains a delight. What a wonderful, Yuji, bless his heart, very, very green, very young. But the role was written for an Asian a boy,
yeah,
and so we was cast out of Vancouver. We didn't have a lot of choices. And he was out of every one of them. He didn't act. He just played himself, and
right,
it worked. And
yeah,
so we gave him the part because he wasn't working the room. He didn't try. That we had a few actors come into the room, and they thought that they'd start chewing on the scenery, and it was silly. And he had none of that because he didn't have the experience. So that's why it worked. But he was a lovely guy.
yeah. And of course, our leading villain, just briefly, Phil, Eric Roberts.
Yes.
What would you like?
Well,
What would you like to say?
well, it's all been said. It's all been said. And let me preface this by saying to you that in later years, Eric and I, he apologized, and he was very nice to me and very gracious. We obviously ran into each other at quite a few conventions and that
Yeah,
sort of a thing, and he regretted his behavior. And so I do want to say that he ended up regretting his behavior, and so he did apologize. So I want to preface it before I say that it was a real challenge with him. I mean, he was heavily into drugs, and he was incredibly difficult. He refused to wear his contact lenses. He refused to wear his makeup. He refused to wear his wardrobe. And so what you see on screen is all, it was literally all we could get him to wear. And so it was one of the most challenging parts of it, and the depressing in some ways, because while we had moments where he would behave himself and we could get a scene or two into the can, his offstage antics, which I don't want to get into, were insane. And so it was, very, 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 very difficult working with him.
Okay, yeah. Um, one thing that's one huge thing that stands out for a lot of people when they think of the TV movie is the TARDIS interior set. I mean, I've seen so many fans on online doing, favorite TARDIS, top 10 TARDIS interior, polls and this, that, and the other. And this one always comes in there. Um, and rightly so. It's an amazing set, Phil. And people always talk about it. It's a talking point all the time. Um, did when you had the idea when you were devising the movie, um, how long did it take, or what sort of ideas came in um, to get to the point where that design took shape? Did you go through different types of things like more futuristic looking interior, or was it always going to be that kind of Victoriana look?
No, it was always going to be that. And I had been working on that behind the scenes for well over 2 years. All the concepts, and in fact, it appeared in the original Bible that I used to sell the show with. It never changed because I was very aware of what happens when a moment in time dates your project. Now, the two perfect examples that we love to talk about are the dystopian world of Star Wars and the utopian world of Star Trek. And if go back and you look at the original television series for Star Trek, and you go back and you look at the original film for Star Wars, you realize what the challenges are, because as technology changes and as futurism evolves and our ideas of futurism evolves, you realize that your moment in time is going to date you. And so I when I started thinking about this, what really was the impetus for it was the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the original Disney movie with James Stewart, not James Stewart, James Mason, excuse me. And I thought to myself, there's something to be said about the timelessness of Victoriana. And it wouldn't matter whether we are 5 years into the future, 50 years into the future, it can't date itself because it's already dated. And so for me, it was never going to be about anything other than that. And so I also had this notion that Gallifrey was this society that has been around for a millennia. If I mean, who knows when the Gallifreyan society evolved and what it evolved into. But I always was haunted by the fact that you could wander around Britain and look at all of the churches that were destroyed by Henry VIII, during his Reformation period, and trying to destroy the church and put it in his own name. And you'd walk into these hulks of ruins with these cathedral, the money and the time that was spent, and you look at it and it felt like this time gone by, but the power of what that was at once. You go into the Abbey, you go into Westminster Abbey, you go into any of these beautiful churches, York, and you realize the immensity of what it meant to the religion and what it meant to a seat of power. And so all of those ideas and the fabric of that thought process went into what I wanted the Gallifreyan Society to think about its things. And so that was really the jumping off point for how we got where we got, where you had these incredible machines that were capable of traveling through time and space, and were able to obviously protect themselves by having these chameleon cloaking devices and all of this technology, which I thought was just incredibly rich. I mean, wonderful. And so putting it all into that package, it kind of all fit for me.
It was beautiful inside because it looked like it was a home as well, that he could live in
It
it,
was.
live in it. Whereas a lot of the other console rooms don't. You know, they might
Well, think
they don't
about
have
it.
any
It was,
furniture inside them or nothing. That you think,
no, but it was his
where did
home.
they
I mean, that's
relax? You
where he
know.
lived. Where else did he live? In all the years, he never went to a condo. He never had an apartment. I mean, this was his home. And so I'm thinking to myself, we need to establish the fact that this is his home. This is where he lives. And so what does that look like? And when you also go back and you think about the wonderful 900-year diary we saw during the Troughton years, and thinking, well, for 900 years he's been writing his diary. I mean he's a very well kept gentleman, but over the years there is obviously the various different incarnations. I love the eccentricities of them all, but I just love the notion that they inherited this home. This Type 40 TARDIS was his home.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's a stunning set. And am I right in saying that it was one of the most expensive standing sets at that time?
Yes.
What
Yes,
was it, about $1 million or so? Was it?
1.5 million just for
Wow,
the
that's just
yeah.
one set in the movie.
Well, yeah,
Regardless of
I
the
mean
other
it
things
was
he did.
that was a real challenge as well because
Yeah.
I I was if I had had a 6 episode or a 13 episode commitment, I could have amortized the cost of those sets over 13 episodes.
Oh yeah.
But I did manage to get the studio to cough up a little extra money, thinking, hey, you've got to think about amortization. We these are out. This is We're going to be living here for years. So I
Yeah,
did
yeah,
for 5 minutes get them to think, okay, well, we'll push a little bit. We'll go a little further than. So they did. To their credit, they did, but they weren't willing to go that far. But they did allow me to build the sets.
yeah. How long did that take to build, Phil? That the TARDIS interior set?
Um, I would say 6 months, just under 6 months.
Yeah. It was huge, wasn't it?
Oh yeah.
It
Oh,
was a
it
massive.
it
Yeah,
was huge. And
yeah.
trying to film it, was a challenge as well because, a lot of the elements that I built weren't in the script, and
Mhm.
that was one of my challenges with Matthew, bless his heart, is his writing was very superficial.
Yeah,
And so I was, all those fight sequences I had to write because the script just said they fight.
yeah,
And the director would come to me the night before or 2 days before and say, "I've got this scene and that was in the Eye of Harmony set." He goes, "I've got this fight, and what are they doing? What are we doing? I don't. It doesn't say anything." So I said, "Okay, well, let me get the stunt coordinator, and if you're willing to do it, I'm willing to do it." And so we spent an entire night on the set talking through the blocking, and I said, I will write it. And I went back to my hotel room and I sat there and I wrote it up based on what the stunt coordinator and the director and I thought should happen, and that's how it happened. But a lot of those elements in the set were there hoping and thinking that, because it was his home, we would see all of this, and in future episodes, we could do a lot in there. We could spend a lot of time in there.
Um, just reminded me actually to just I have to mention the director Jeffrey Sachs. How did you find it working with Jeff on that? Um,
Well, he was a lovely guy. He had a wonderful sense of humor, a wonderful sense of humor. When he was trying to get Matthew to change some dialogue, and Matthew wasn't up on the set. I don't know. I can't remember why he wasn't there, but he wasn't there. And we had this fax machine, and next to it we had a giant trash can with all the shredded pages that had come through that we didn't like, and we shred them. And every morning, uh, Jeff would climb in the trash can, and he would stand there with just holding shreds of paper going, okay, I'm not leaving until I get another page, and I hope I don't have to shred it. And that was his sense of humor. But uh he was very thoughtful, and he was very good with the cast. If he had one weakness for me, it was, sense of scope wasn't really a skill fit for him. A lot of the shows that he directed were on very small prosceniums, and so getting a filmic scope was difficult for him. And action sequences were a little bit of a challenge for him. But he really, I think, with scene work, I think he did a terrific job, and he was a delight to work with.
um, so um, I'm curious if you ever got as far as perhaps having storylines or outlines of anything, any future episodes, had it got picked up for a series. Had you got that far with any ideas that where you would have taken it?
Well, we had, and a lot of them were already in the Bible. I
Oh,
mean,
right, yeah,
because one of this moment in time, Frank, there were a lot of things that you would say to a network and tell a network to give it confidence in you and confidence that they had made the right decision to do it.
yeah,
And one of the selling points was we had 750 episodes that we could pull story from.
yeah.
So you will, me saying to the network, you will never have to worry about story. If I reference something, we can just plug in a tape and look at it, and you can say yay or nay, but you'll see the mechanics of what we can do. And they love that. They love that. They love the comfort level of that. It wasn't like, a lot of series television in those days. It was a real challenge to produce because when a show was ordered, the networks and the studios never gave the writers enough time to write. So what was so ridiculous is if you knew you were going to get a 20 episode order or a 13 episode order, why wouldn't you start your writers immediately? Well, they wouldn't, because they needed the writers during production to change and fix and evolve stories. So they didn't understand, and they didn't have the money to get writers on staff soon enough to get material out fast enough so that you could amortize costs, you could see where you were going. So that was it was big. And so I had picked a bunch of different stories from the Baker era especially, that we could evolve and change or look at again. But they were all the classic stories. We were going to Cybermen, we were going to do Daleks, we were going to do all of the villain pieces that you do. And Earth was always a central core to that. His passion to protect this civilization from all these enemies that had chased him. And then, of course, there were going to be episodes where we went to those planets, or we got knocked off course and we found ourselves trying to help somebody who turned out to be involved in something that involved someone that he had, been involved in the past, because the universe is a small place when you have a time machine. So it was all of that, and so there was a tremendous confidence level from everybody, including the network, that storytelling and our ability to mine stories were never going to be an issue.
Had it reached the point where it got taken up as a series? What would have been what would have been the kind of format back then, Phil? Would it have been like a 13 episode season?
Yes, it
Is
would.
that the kind of thing that would occur? Or
Yeah, but the way they structured their deals, because it was all driven by advertising, right? So if the numbers weren't there, they needed to be able to kill the order and go to something else. So they always had one or two things in the wings. But usually the way it started was you'd get an order for six, and in that order for six, as you started to air, you watched your numbers, and so by the third week, you would know whether your audience was growing or if it was flat, or we were losing audience. You would have known that, and so they would base their decision to go on to the next, order, the back order, based on the pure economics of it. It was all driven by numbers. You have to remember, before there was streaming services and the distribution systems were so disruptive, it was all about ad revenue. And so television shows in the United States were nothing more than a filler for their real business, which was advertising. We were just a filler. We weren't entertainment. We weren't in the entertainment business. Everybody called it the entertainment business, but trust me when I tell you, it is the advertising business. That's what it is. Other than live events and everything else, in the time that I spent in the business, it was an ad revenue driven business, because that was the distribution system. And it's very hard for fans and people to uh, get their head around it, and you had to, because as a producer, you had to, because otherwise, your head would explode with all the stupidity.
yeah, it seems to be that unfortunately that's how the wheels turn there. You know. Um, uh, Now moving on, Phil, just a little bit before we close up on this, because I've taken up an awful lot of your time and I really appreciate it.
Of
But
course.
um, you went on to do. I'm just curious what the shift that you had, in a sense. Later on, you became a producer of a lot of TV kind of
I did.
films and documentaries. What, was that just something that was offered to you, or did you have an interest in that kind of subject?
No, it's complicated, and I don't want to get into too many of the details, but
Yeah,
suffice it to say, I was in my first marriage was a very complicated marriage, and I had a young son, and so as a producer, it became harder and harder for me to take jobs that left the where I left Los Angeles.
yeah, yeah,
So that was one part of it. The other part of it was that if you go back and you kind of study that moment in time, and it was around, somewhere around 99 to 2000, 2002, scripted television was in real trouble. Uh, a lot of the costs had skyrocketed. Distribution systems were weakening. There were questions, about revenue streams, and all of it. And so I had ended up taking a job, just because I was forced to, for personal reasons. I ran Tribune Studios for a few years. I was head of production, and I actually directed quite a few of the action hours, and there was Andromeda and Mutant X and all of those shows, or Final Conflict and all of that. But it was very difficult. I mean, if you go back and look, pronouncements were being made by network executives. The situation comedy is dead. Television movies are dead. We're no longer making miniseries. And it went on and on and on. And so I realized that it was going to be a difficult time to be in the business and also have to deal with my personal situation. So my agent at the time said to me, "Look, we represent John Murray from Bune and Murray, who created the Real World, and he wants to be in scripted programming. And you're saying it's going to be difficult for you to find work." He said, "Why don't you teach him how to do scripted television shows, and he'll teach you how to do reality television." And I said, why not? I met John and he hired me, and so I learned how to make reality television from John Murray. And so that led me to a meeting with a man who became my partner in crime, Tom Beers, who I had met years earlier, who was producing for Turner, Jacques Cousteau's adventures and animal shows. And anyway, we ran into each other a bunch of times, and he said, "Hey, I'm launching something. Why don't you come over here and work with me, and let's see if we can make television." So I did, and the rest, as they say, is history. It ended up being a very successful partnership. We did very well. I mean, we produced some iconic television, whether it was from Deadliest Catch to Ice Road Truckers and Storage Wars, and everything in between. And I ended up producing almost 5,000 hours of television, reality television. And so it was a very successful run. But then as all things are, we decided that it was a good thing to sell the company and get out while we could. And so that's what happened. But you know, I have no regrets. I'm thrilled for the time that I spent in the business, 38 wonderful years. But as everybody has a story, and it was very difficult for me to stick around because of my personal situation, and so I just lost the taste for it all after 2017, when I finally officially bowed out. And but I'm happy now, and I'm happily retired now, and I enjoy my life. I have I build my models on Spruverse, my YouTube channel, and my subscribers are awesome. I'm a little over 6,000 subscribers now, and I've only been doing this a couple of years, but I enjoy it. I this is what I do, and I love my community. I love the hobbying world, and it gives me joy. I have an awesome son, who's just turned 30. He has an awesome kid, and they all live in Florida, so I get to enjoy them, and I'm enjoying the last act.
Well, I'm really pleased about that, Phil. By the way, guys, at the end of this interview with Phil, if he very kindly gave me permission to show a clip from one of his episodes on his YouTube channel called Spruverse, SPRUE verse. And also, so if you want to check out Phil's channel, please do go over there on YouTube. If you like model kit work, and you have a vested interest or a fascination with that, it's well worth watching. And so we'll show that little clip at the end. I think that will be of interest to not only model makers, but also to Doctor Who fans.
Yeah, they would enjoy it. I also, Frank, built as on the channel. I built the interior of my TARDIS. Some of my subscribers were kind enough to send me some files and some parts and pieces, and I built the interior. So it's a wonderful model.
That would be wonderful to see as well. Yeah, so please go over there, guys, and say just at the end of this thing, hang on at the end of this interview when we say goodbye to you, and there'll be a little clip, and there'll be a link in my description underneath this video for you to go over and visit Phil's channel. Please do that. because he's been very kind to talk to me for this length of time. So, Phil, it's been a pleasure. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for talking to me. I
Of
really, really
course.
appreciate that.
I enjoyed it.
It's been great. And so, guys, take care. We'll speak very soon with another interviewee from the world of Doctor Who. Until then, take care. Bye bye.
Hi, I'm Philip Segal. I was the executive producer of the '96 Paul McGann movie Doctor Who that aired on the Fox network. And for over 25 years, more actually, almost 30, this police box has been in my custody, but out of the eyes of the general public. And most people don't know its origins and why it was actually constructed. And so I thought it would be fun to create a short video just to sort of share this with you and go into details about it and give you a real sort of detailed tour and a look around it, and we'll get close to it in a minute. This police box was constructed in Vancouver, British Columbia during pre-production of the film. The sole purpose of this miniature was for the main title sequence that you see when we first see the TARDIS spinning in space. It was not CG, it was not an effect, it was this miniature. It was produced lovingly by a young Polish artisan. He was in his 20s, and he did this in about 3 weeks. And he copied the plans from the box that was given us from, from the BBC. At the time, we were told it was the Tom Baker box. But then we were told it was the John Pertwee box. So I'm not entirely sure where the plans came from, but there were some changes and additions that he made to sort of make it his own, little details. So when a lot of people have seen a couple of photos that I've shared with them over the years, not just on my Instagram account, Spruverse, but also just from the book I wrote called Doctor Who Regeneration, where I talk about this, and there are some photos in there, but they've asked me, well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And, you know, when you have an opportunity to add to folklore and create something new, it's fun to make things your own. And so this box was lovingly produced on that basis. It was never used for anything else in the film. It may have been for the series. We may have kept it to one side and used it for other things, but it was never used again in the film. That was it. It was brought to Los Angeles, where the main title sequence was filmed, and then it was put in its crate, this box, and it was sealed up, and it was kept under my careful eye, just to make sure it didn't disappear, as a lot of props do. A lot of people ask me about a lot of the sets from the film. Where did they end up? You know, sadly, a lot of them were broken up. Some were taken. Some things have been lovingly restored. But at the end of the day, when it's just a film and not a series, studios rarely care about what happens to the sets once the film is completed. Okay, so let's take a closer look and talk about some of the details. First of all, how big is it? Okay, so its base measures approximately 14 inches in length. From the platform, side to side, it measures approximately 1 foot, 12 and a quarter inches. 12 and a quarter inches. And its height from base to the roof is 26 inches. And from the base to the very top of the light, it measures approximately 31, just about 31 inches. So that's to give you some details. The actual construction was made of wood. It's all pine construction, with a texture coat on the outside. Those are the same kinds of texture coats that you'll see put on walls. It was plaster, and it was dried to give it this texture, to sort of give it that aged look. Because a lot of the police boxes over the years were never sanded and sealed. They were just painted over and over and over again. I do not have an exact color match for this blue. I apologize. But over the years, I can tell you, it's gotten a little darker. But at the time, it did have a dirty stain put on it just to give it some wear. The windows themselves are acrylic. We have some clear, and then we have what's called some, it looks like sort of bubble glass. But what they actually did was they took the nib of a soldering iron and just simply melted the clear. So you have these different looks. That's how that was achieved. The sign for the police box was lovingly created, as all signs are in a CAD program. This was obviously where the phone was kept for these boxes. For those of you who don't know the history of these boxes, they were designed by an American in New York City. They didn't come to England until well after I think about 1880. So it's an interesting history. It was actually an American invention, not a British invention. And I thought that was really interesting because at the time when I was getting ready to make the film, Fox did not want me to use the police box. They thought it was tired and old. They said, come up with a new look for his spaceship. And I said, first of all, it's not a spaceship, it's a time machine. And second of all, there's a history here. There's a reason why this police box looks the way it does. And as we all know, it was because his cloaking device failed and it was never able to materialize as anything else. And so, of course, we have the traditional police box, which I think is the finest time machine in the universe. And that is my opinion. All the handles on this are handmade. They're made of brass, and they have been patinaed just a little bit to age them. The hinges themselves, all handmade, which I think is just a beautiful touch. Look at the keyhole, all handmade. And of course, the handle to the door itself is a little latch handle from a jewelry box, which I thought was always was beautiful. Each side of the box is basically the same, but I'll turn them so you can see each side, and you can see that the glass panels are randomly put in here. But I think it's fun for you to see each side. Surprisingly, it's in great shape for being almost 30 years old. I have a little bit of failure here on one of the glass that has to be restored. And so we're gonna have to do that. And I'll turn it to the last side so that you can see all four sides. And there you go. So now, come in a little closer and we'll look at this lamp, because this lamp has been a bone of contention for a lot of people. It's obviously, this lamp is modeled after an old seafaring lamp. And what we have here is we have a turned piece of acrylic tubing that was put on a lathe, and then it was simply scored with a chisel. That's how this was created. The outside is all handmade. The wire and the patinaed coppered top and bottom, all handmade. And then of course, the four posts that encase it in the top of the lamp.